You may have seen one streak across the night sky, and there could be one hovering a few hundred miles above you right now. No, I'm not talking about UFOs, but satellites, and more specifically, the thousands of Starlink satellites that have taken over our skies and changed the broadband landscape forever. I'm Diana Gooverts, and this is the 5-9. Today, we're taking a look at how Starlink has stormed the satellite connectivity market, how it has helped thrust satellite technology into the middle of the broadband conversation, and what that means for the future of connectivity. Now, I'm not going to talk about this by myself, so joining me to dig into these questions today are two very special guests. We have Marek, who is editorial director at Ookla, which you may know for its speed test data. And we also have Joe Madden, who is founder of analyst firm Mobile Experts. Let's jump right in. Who plays in the satellite broadband market? And is all satellite service the same, or are there different kinds of satellite providers? Joe, maybe you can start for us.
Yeah, well, there's legacy providers that have been doing this for some time, and the interesting part about this market is that what they consider broadband or high bandwidth connections has been just eclipsed by Starlink. So we have the new satellite systems, Starlink, and eventually we'll have Project Kuiper satellites that provide a lot more bandwidth because they'll be launching a lot larger number of satellites. And so, whereas before we were using satellites from SES or Hughes or Viasat, Intelsat. Some of these companies had satellites in higher orbits that had designated satellite spectrum, and they would provide bandwidth over a wide swath of geographic area. Now we have these low Earth orbit satellites, such as Starlink, that are providing that bandwidth over a much smaller area of the Earth. And that means when you reuse the frequencies so many times across each country, you end up with a lot of bandwidth. And so the bandwidth constraint is changing as we go from some of the legacy providers, the Viasats and SES and so on, to the new providers like Starlink and Kuiper.
Sue, do you have anything to add? I think the LEO versus GEO satellites is a very interesting contrast.
Yeah, I mean, we've tested both with our speed tests, which are user generated tests, and we can definitely see a difference in the types of capabilities that people get from either the geo services versus the LEO services, and we've measured both. And latency is really, which is the speed of the reaction of the signal. Um, is very different with geos. I think that's one of the primary. Not only are download speeds and upload speeds different, but latency is really high. So you don't have the responsiveness with the Viasat or the HughesNet services that you do with Starlink. So I think that's kind of the
Okay.
dramatic difference that we've measured.
So I think most people listening to this podcast, I mean, they have to be listening, probably have some kind of fixed internet service. So whether it's cable from Comcast, whether it's fiber from somebody like AT&T or Frontier, or even fixed wireless, right? The
Mhm.
5G home internet that Verizon and T-Mobile are peddling. Uh, they already have that service. So why the heck do we need satellite broadband? Why is somebody like Starlink willing to spend so much on it? And what is it good for? Like, what are the use cases that we're looking at here?
Well, I can take that one first because I'm talking over a Starlink right now. I live in a rural part of California, cattle country in California, where the nearest mountaintop where I can get a fixed wireless signal is about 15 miles away. So that's a pretty long distance for fixed wireless. There's no fiber in my neighborhood. And so Starlink has been the best option for me for the last 3 years. And so I think that's really the primary use case. It's those remote users that are just far enough away from a fiber hub that they really don't have a good option to access that. And there's hundreds of millions of those people around the world, maybe a billion people around the world that can use much better broadband services and are willing to pay a certain amount for it.
just think there's a lot more people that I live in Colorado, and although I'm in a city, there's a lot of areas of Colorado that have really poor broadband, if any broadband. And we have a lot of people who are very remote from any sort of connectivity, and they're working remotely, and there's definitely demand in a lot of these states.
I think there's also an emerging direct to device use case that's kind of coming out where the satellites can provide connectivity to your mobile phone if you're, I think, in a national park, but can something like Starlink be used for that? Sue, I know that you're a big camper. Is that something that you've kind of looked at all?
Yeah. I mean, that's like T-Mobile has a service using Starlink called T-Satellite, and it's fairly new on the market. And we've done some measuring of it and looking at the. It appears that a lot of people are taking advantage of that service. But even Starlink, not to my cell phone, just as a broadband connectivity. There's a version of it that they offer to RV users. And so you can use it with your camping. And I've seen in the past, I'm a camper, and in the past few years, I've seen a lot more people in campgrounds with their Starlink dishes. It's a little bit pricey, I think, but for a lot of people, having that connectivity, they're willing to pay. And so I think it's definitely a growing use case.
I was just thinking, I wanted to also touch on the competitive dynamics that this introduces into the market, right? So it was fixed wireless was the original kind of disruptor. I know it's been around for quite a while through WISPs, but I feel like T-Mobile and Verizon have maybe popularized that. But now Starlink and satellite broadband is emerging as a huge disruptor, especially when it comes to things like broadband expansion and funding efforts. I think some data that just came out showed that they're expecting about 20% of the $42 billion BEAD program to go to satellite. So I'm just kind of curious on, does that change the way cable and fiber companies have to compete in the market? I'm curious about what your thoughts on, Joe. I don't know if you have anything you want to.
Well, I do. I mean, I'm very opinionated on this. In fact, my wife is very opinionated when it comes to the cable companies because, they've been providing us services for a long time as monopolies, and I think all of us have had experiences where we try to call our local cable company for some kind of a service, and we're on hold for 2 or 3 hours trying to get a technician to come and help us. Uh, that behavior can't continue. If a cable company is providing broadband service now in a neighborhood, they have competition. You can anytime you can go to Starlink, but also there are overbuilders that are now coming into every region of the United States and providing a second alternative. So I think this is becoming a much more competitive market where it was really not competitive at all 10 years ago. And the just the resurgence of fixed wireless access methods and different companies overlapping each other means that we have 2 or 3 options in every location in the country today. That's just good for business.
And I mean, to the point of price, somebody I was speaking with recently told me that their cable company was charging them upwards of $180 a month just for broadband. Um, I personally pay $65 for fiber. So that was wild to me. Sue, I know you mentioned it's pricey. Can you give a ballpark of what kind of satellite broadband service costs are?
Their prices run from $80 a month to $120 a month. I mean, I'm like you. I'm on fixed wireless actually, and I'm in an urban area, but it was just a nice option and a competitive option for me, especially with the bundles that they offer. But yeah, Starlink is about $80 to $120 a month, and then that RV package is $150 a month. So, but what you're saying with the cable companies, that's not that pricey.
Yeah, it definitely seems like they're going to have to really rethink their pricing strategy with satellite coming to the fore, which brings me to my next question, right? So if satellite is gaining popularity, if they are going to be reaching so many more locations, especially through programs like BEAD, how much speed and bandwidth are we talking about here? I mean, are they on par with fiber? Are they better or worse than fixed wireless access? Sue, I know you guys have done quite a bit of testing, so I'm kind of curious for your thoughts here.
So if you use the FCC's their kind of criteria for the broadband speeds of 100 megabits per second down and 20 megabits per second up. In my recent report, Starlink, like about a little less than 20% of the speed test users across the US were able to get those sort of median broadband speeds that the FCC requires. So 20%, less than 20%, about, I think it was like 17.5%. Um, so that's maybe a small percentage, but their speeds are increasing. If you look at what we've been measuring, we started Q1 2022 for their median download speeds. Now, we did see them start at about 95.74 megabits per second. They dropped down a little bit, and we think that was due to they were kind of adjusting for congestion and also launching more satellites. And then as of the Q1 2024, which is the last time I measured it, the data I have anyway, they were at 104.71 megabits per second. So they're reaching that 100 megabit per second median for download speeds. And then in the upload speeds, we kind of saw the same trend. They started at like 9.8 in the first quarter of 2022. Now they're around 14.8, 15. So they're reaching that upload speed criteria. And these are median. So that's, putting everyone in the same, it's a little different. You could take different percentages. So they have some users who get a lot better than that, some users who get a lot lower than that, but that's kind of where we are. But latency is the other thing that I think we need to talk about too in these speeds, because with Starlink, they're around 45 that's milliseconds in latency, which is, again, it's improved over time. But it's something to consider. If you look at the geostationary satellites, they're going to be much higher, like in the 95 and 1,000. So use cases, people are going to experience delays, I guess, with the latency from those geostationary satellites. But with LEOs, it's much better. But still, there might be some noticeable delay.
Joe, I know you have strong opinions about whether or not speed is the defining characteristic of these kinds of services, so go off.
Okay. Well, I think speed was the most important characteristic back in the days where we were transitioning from dial up to broadband. When we went from 1 megabit per second to 2 to 5 megabits to 10 megabits, keeping track of your speed was really the most important metric because it really affected the performance of what people did at that time. But now we have options that range between 100 and 500 megabits per second. And honestly, people don't see the difference. If we're streaming video or doing a call like this here, having 20 megabits uplink and 50 megabits downlink is enough. And any option that exceeds those numbers is just gravy. It's just icing on the cake. And so I think we've reached a point where the difference in speed from one option to another is not the most important factor. What I've been testing is packet loss. So when I do this kind of a video call, you may notice that every once in a while the call may freeze for a second, or the voice will get a little choppy, the audio might get choppy. That really comes from a set of bad packets or late packets arriving in the stream. It's the kind of thing that's smoothed out when you're streaming a video from Netflix, and that goes into your buffer, and you never notice that at all. But I think right now the most challenging use case for most people is the video call use case. And it's the packet loss statistics that really govern how smooth that video appears to people on the line with you. And so I've done testing with unlicensed fixed wireless, with licensed CBRS fixed wireless, with Starlink, and with fiber. And I see some pretty big differences in terms of how many packets are lost. In other words, packets that take more than 2 or 3 seconds and just never come in. And in terms of the percentage of packets that are delayed. Instead of coming in the normal 40 milliseconds, they come maybe after 200 milliseconds. And those are the kinds of things that create that choppy behavior. And what I've noticed is that the satellite systems are good. They're not as good as fiber when it comes to the reliability of the packet data, but they can be better than unlicensed fixed wireless or some other formats. So I think there is a place there again for those remote places where there's just no other way to get data through.
Do you have any thoughts on why that is? So I'm thinking for the unlicensed fixed wireless, I'm wondering if there's maybe congestion on that spectrum. Do companies like Starlink use unlicensed spectrum as well, or are they using licensed? And I'm not talking about what they just bought from Dish. That's not active yet.
Right. Yeah. We could talk about the direct to device spectrum another time, but right here I'm talking about licensed spectrum in the KU and KA bands. That's 14 gigahertz and above. And these are satellite bands. And so, when you have the Starlink dish on the roof of your house, that's communicating at a much higher frequency with very high bandwidth to the satellite. And that is licensed. Now, the difference between unlicensed and licensed is that in unlicensed, you have multiple users and you can have what we call collisions where two people are transmitting at the same time and the signal doesn't always get through to the intended receiver. And that's the nature of the way that unlicensed formats work. They're a contention based format. And so those are sort of baked into the process. Now, in the unlicensed case, you can coordinate those things and you can own that spectrum, and you know that your packet's going to go through with a much higher certainty.
I'm gonna need you guys to engage in some wizardry with me. It's spooky season, so we're gonna bust out our crystal ball. We're gonna look into the future, right? So, couple years down the line, Starlink has continued to launch new satellites. They have their new spectrum from Dish. They have new competition in the form of Project Kuiper being kind of finally active. Where is this all going? What does it mean for the broader broadband industry? I don't know. Sue, do you maybe want to start? Do you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I think especially as they're launching more satellites, I think we'll continue to see better performance and from Starlink. I do think Kuiper's one to watch. I'm really interested to see. I think they're supposed to be commercial in 4Q or something like that. So I'll be interested to see how their service rolls out and how they price it. But yeah, I think there's definitely demand for this. And I look primarily at the US market, but Joe alluded to the fact that there are regions, some of our other analysts look at other regions of the world where, they just don't even have the fiber infrastructure that we have. And I think there's definitely demand for it. I think we're going to continue to see this grow and become more competitive.
Joe, what is your crystal ball telling you?
Well, I certainly agree with what Sue says, and there's a huge opportunity internationally. I think we're going to see in the U.S. market, we're going to see each broadband uh, format fall into the sweet spot that it's best for. So in the U.S., we're going to see Starlink and Kuiper serving those remote users, and that's a pretty well established pattern in the U.S. already. But in other countries, I think it's going to be an enterprise solution. I'll give you one example. I'm active with a charity that's building a hospital in Uganda right now, in a rural part of Uganda, in the center of Africa. And this is a rural community. There's no broadband options at all, and so the hospital is likely to set up a Starlink so that they can keep their medical records and access the internet. We're going to have some of my friends who are doctors in Stanford dialing in and doing video calls with the surgeons there on the ground in Africa. So great use case, but that's a case where I think in the U.S. they would pull a fiber to that building, and in Africa that's not a solution that's possible. So there's just a lot of customers in other countries of the world that will want to step up to Starlink, even though it's very expensive for that region. It's something they're going to want to do because they have a strong use case.
All right, last question before I unleash you guys. Who has the most to lose from satellite broadband gaining share? Tricky, tricky. Is this going to wipe out the wisps, or is it going to make cable companies really get competitive? Like, how do we see that playing out in this future scenario in the crystal ball?
Oh, so yeah, I would just think any rural providers, um, this as their speeds get better, it's going to be harder for WISPs, which are primarily in smaller rural areas, to compete, I think. I don't know, Joe, I'm less sure about the cable guys because I don't feel like they've really touched a lot of rural areas.
Yeah, that's true. I think that, well, the cable guys, they have a certain footprint that they expand to and then they stop. And the WISPs, the small rural providers are taking advantage of the fact that the cable guys didn't invest in a small town, such as the small town where I live. And local WISPs, they do stand to lose quite a lot from the satellites becoming available. It basically takes that vacuum away from them, and that's what their livelihood was based on. I also think the cable guys have a lot to lose. The cable companies lost their TV business to the streaming side, and so that was the most lucrative part of their business. They lost that 10 years ago, and now people are encroaching. The mobile operators are encroaching on their broadband subscribers. Starlink is taking some of their broadband subscribers. People are overbuilding, and fiber from BEAD is coming into different areas. So I think the cable companies, uh, you know, I I, I see a future. If we're talking about crystal balls right now, I see a future where we see consolidation, cable companies merging with mobile operators because they just can't really survive on their own. And for that matter, I think the satellite constellations may, to some extent, partner, joint venture, merge with the terrestrial operators to create the kinds of services that they want.
Well, we all know that Starlink is owned by someone with ungodly amounts of money, so maybe we'll see a Starlink Comcast merger someday in the future. Who knows? But that will have to stay in the crystal ball for right now. Thank you guys so much for your time. I appreciate you chatting with me today.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.